Stick it to him.
Sorry about that. Oh. Yes, thank you all so much for coming. So we have today with us Mr. Lee Child, who is the global best-selling author of the Jack Reacher series. And I've read that somewhere in the world, a Jack Reacher book is bought every 9 seconds. He was appointed CBE for services to literature and has an honorary doctorate from Coventry University and raised in Birmingham.
Yeah.
So I've got a few questions from myself, and it'll probably take about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from yourselves at the end. Is that all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have Waterstones with us, thank you very much, in the back over there. So at the end, we'll sort of form a queue, and Lee said he's happy to sign books. And
I'll sign anything except a check or a confession.
Yes.
The first thing I wanted to ask you was, you're a huge supporter of public libraries. Could you tell us about your library as a boy and how you began your life as a reader?
Yeah, well, I began my life as a reader actually in Coventry. As you said, I was born in Coventry. My dad had a job where they moved him around a lot at the beginning to give him experience of different things. So my elder brother was born in London.
Yeah.
Then they moved to Leicester. I was conceived in Leicester, born in Coventry, and then we moved to Birmingham before I started primary school. But my elder brother started primary school in Coventry, and I was insane with jealousy that he could do stuff I couldn't do. And our mother, this was, way long ago in the 1950s, my mother was one of those generation that really believed education was the key to everything. If you got a good education, you'd get a good job. And that's what they wanted for me. They wanted, for all of us, really. They wanted us to live in a semi-detached house instead of a terrace and have a 2-year-old car instead of a 5-year-old car. And they thought education was the way to do that. So my mother, when my big brother came home from primary school every afternoon, she would sit him down and go over the lessons to make sure he was understanding them, which was, the attitude people had back then. Do well, get on, you'll be okay. And as it happened, my brother was a really smart guy. He ended up a nuclear scientist in the end. But actually at the beginning it looked a bit tricky because he wasn't doing well, but they very quickly figured out it was because he couldn't see. He couldn't see the blackboard. And so as soon as he got glasses, he was doing fine. But still, she kept going over and over these lessons. And so because I was jealous that he could read and do sums and all of that, I would eavesdrop kind of over his shoulder to what he was doing. And over 2-3 months, I taught myself to read at the age of 3. And I taught myself all the letters and how to do sums and all that kind of thing. So I've been reading since I was 3, and picture books at first, and then maybe when I was 4, I moved on to textbooks. And we were not poor, I don't want to make out like we were poverty stricken, but back then everybody was poor. Yeah. There was no money. Everybody had a job, but all money had to go to pay off war loans to America. So that even though people were working, they didn't have much cash. And in fact, in Birmingham, everybody was paid on a Friday in cash in a little brown envelope. And where elsewhere in the world they say as rare as hen's teeth, in Birmingham they said as rare as a pound note on a Thursday. And that's how it was. I mean, we always had shoes, we had 3 meals a day, but nothing else. And definitely not books. Inconceivable that you could buy a book. So we would go to the library, and our nearest library was a tiny little one. There was a bomb-damaged place across the main road from where I lived, and there was the remnant of a house. So quite a big suburban villa, and it was behind a church. It might have been a vicarage, actually. And just one ground floor room was the library. And I remember the smell of it, the dust and the sort of vague burnt smell from when it had been a bomb site. And it had about 300 books, and I read them all by the time I was about 7.
Yeah.
And then the only good thing my mother really ever did for me was she then signed me up for the next library along, which was in the next little municipality, Perry Bar, called Tower Hill Library. And you got there, it was a long walk. You had to walk quite a long way, and then a scary footbridge over the canal that in my 7-year-old mind was like in the jungle, you know, one of those rope bridges in the jungle over this ravine. It felt like that. And then you got to the other side, you turned left, and there was this huge, glittering glass skyscraper, absolutely full of books. Later, of course, it wasn't a glass skyscraper at all. It was a normal 2-story building with large windows. But to me, it was just this magical place packed full of books. And the problem was Birmingham let you have 2 books a week on a ticket, and that was not enough for me. So I instituted this Chicago voter fraud system in our house, that if any visitor whatsoever came to the house had to sign up for a library ticket, and our dog had a library ticket, so that I could get 6 books a week, which was what I consumed. And I've done that all my life. I read about 6 books a week. And so, yeah, I just reading, because it was, I mean, my family was okay. They were pretty dull. They were pretty boring, very repressed and respectable people. And life was gray and miserable, basically. I hated it. But with books, you could escape. You know, I very quickly realized with a book, you could be anybody. Anywhere in the world, any time of history, or in the future. You know, I lived about 200 lives probably by the time I was a teenager, just from reading. So it was always a huge, huge passion of mine.
Did you have any favorite books as a child?
Oh, you know, I'm not one of those pretentious people that says I was reading Dostoevsky when I was 8. You know, I was reading all the usual stuff. Enid Blyton. I loved Enid Blyton at the beginning. Famous Five, Secret Seven, The Island of Adventure, all those series. I liked Biggles. I liked Just William. Then I moved, by the time I was about 9 or 10, I moved on to Alistair MacLean, and I really liked him. And on and on and on until I read Ian Fleming, the James Bond.
Yeah.
And that was actually the Ian Fleming thing was a real eye-opener for me, in a way, later, because I went to a very posh school. You know, my mother's technique paid off, that we, in primary school, we worked hard. We sat an exam for King Edward's School, which was the direct grant school in Edgbaston. And I got in with a scholarship because I'd been, you know, my primary school, and I'm sure people will remember it, very basic old-fashioned primary school. You did reading, writing, arithmetic. And literally, but I left at the age of 10 to go to the secondary school. And at the age of 10, I knew everything that I needed to know. I could not have had a day's more education and I'd have functioned perfectly well, because that's how primary schools were. You know, they were very rigorous. But anyway, so I got into this fancy school and we started learning Latin. And in school, we were doing Ovid's telling of the Theseus legend, you know, Theseus and the Minotaur, reading that in Latin. And on the bus home, I was reading Dr. No by Ian Fleming. And I suddenly realized this is exactly the same story. And it totally was. It was absolutely the same story. And it taught me there aren't that many stories. There are not that many plots. Yeah. It's all about the character. You know, James Bond is what people remember. My personal touchstone is the Lone Ranger. Yeah, everybody my age remembers the Lone Ranger, right? Not a person in the world could tell you what a storyline from the Lone Ranger. It was always about just the character, is what you remember.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. I would love to ask you. We were just talking about how libraries are a bit of an endangered species at the moment. And in Birmingham and where I'm from in North Wales, they've slashed their library hours in half completely, and they're under attack in a lot of places. Not as much as in America, thankfully. But what would you say to any councils considering making cuts to their library services?
I'd say I completely understand the financial pressure. Birmingham totally cocks it up and they're bankrupt, and I get that.
Yeah.
And that is a reality. But if you've got to save money somewhere, libraries not the place.
Yeah.
Libraries should be bottom of that list, because libraries right now are super fascinating as we enter a more and more digital world. What are they for? We don't really know what they're going to be for, but they're going to be for something. And they're incredibly important as community centers and for kids like me who had no other access to books or information. And in my case, it was because books were too expensive. But there's numerous categories of kids like that who, maybe they come from...
Martin, just take the treble down slightly, that should sort it.
Oh, okay.
The treble where you're feeding back. Treble.
The high? Which one is the treble? The high one?
That's the
It's
high.
got
Yeah.
high, medium, or low?
High.
High. All right. Let's try that.
How's that? Can you still hear?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Yeah, so libraries are, they're a resource for young people especially, and there's a lot of decent young people who are unfortunately not in decent homes. They live in chaotic homes, noisy all the time, frantic. Maybe the parents haven't paid the bill, and so the Wi-Fi is cut off. They can't do their homework. They need somewhere to go. And so I think I call libraries food banks for the brain, and we need to keep them open. And so this is why I'm doing this. In America, libraries are very random. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are in dire straits.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them are, libraries in the US are funded by local taxes, and some of them are incredibly well endowed. And I can get 30 grand for doing a library event at one of the posh ones.
Really? That's great.
Yeah, and then you go to another one and they got no money at all.
Yeah.
So it's very disparate in the US, but here it's a vital service. It's got to keep on going. It will keep on going, I'm sure. The one that I mentioned, Tower Hill, the glittering glass skyscraper, they got in touch with me a couple of years ago because they were having real funding problems.
Yeah.
And so we tried a campaign to keep it open and succeeded. It is still open.
Yeah.
But like you said, 2 days a week or 2.5 days a week, not good enough. So, but at least it's there so that if they scrapped it altogether, that's gone. But at least it's still there. It can increase its opening hours again. And let's hope it does.
Yeah, it's a very different battle in America to here, isn't it? Because in America, there's a lot of the censorship stuff going on, whereas here it's funding and...
Yeah, there's, because it's locally funded and locally controlled, in America, you do get local committees running libraries with obviously the danger of having total nutcases on it. And they're banning books that are inconvenient, and I'm proud to say 3 or 4 of mine are banned in Florida. And I cannot imagine why. I can't understand why, but I'm glad I joined the bad people.
It's nice to be on. We recently had a display, literally. These books are banned in Florida, so they're probably brilliant.
Yeah, exactly.
There was recently a new exhibition put up in Grand Central Station in Birmingham, celebrating your work. And I loved seeing your old notes, and we took our daughters and stood them next to Jack Reacher and came up to about his knees. I think I only came up to about his belly, to be honest. What does it mean for you coming from the West Midlands? There's a huge amount of local pride around yourself, around Jack Reacher. Every person who comes to the desk, and I've been like, oh, Lee Child's coming to the library. Every one of them has said, oh, he's from Birmingham.
Yeah.
And I'm really proud of it.
Yeah. Well, I was I mean, I'm perpetually in this state of astonishment that anybody cares or pays any attention. You know, I'm not big-headed about it. I'm always amazed when people have read the books and like them and are interested in them. And so the exhibition is like in the upstairs part of the ballroom.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was amazing. First of all, I was a little dubious because the last one that was done was Ozzy Osbourne.
Oh, right.
And he immediately died. So I thought, you know, is this like, you know, the fingers of death on your neck? But they did it. It's, yeah, and they got stuff from, again, this is an astonishing thing to me, that the University of East Anglia in Norwich, which is kind of the writers' university in Britain, they wanted my archive. They got in touch and said, can we have your archive? And I wasn't really even sure did I have an archive? But yeah, I had boxes and boxes of stuff. I'm a terrible keeper. I keep things all the time. My idea was I'd just keep everything. Then when I was old and grey, I could look through it all and remember that it had happened. So I had all these boxes of stuff. And I said, do you mean this kind of thing? And they said, yeah. So I said, sure, knock yourself out. You can have it if you want. But the problem was it was completely undifferentiated. There was a lot of personal stuff in there, you know, like birthday cards I got. And so the archivist up in Norwich has had a hell of a time, you know, separating it all out. But they've got it really good. And yeah, it was because my career, the first part of it, maybe the first third or the first half, was still very much in the analog era. In other words, there were letters to and fro, there were printed manuscripts, printed editorial comments, notes in the margin, all that kind of stuff. So that, yeah, you know, the first half of mine is on display. Second half is harder because a lot of it is now just email.
Yeah.
Although they do have digital archivists that can apparently capture, you know, your email from 30 years ago, which I think is worrying. But you know, they'll start that next, I think.
I understand you've kept the pencil you originally wrote with.
Yeah, that was because my entire investment in this, as you say, Arisha Books on average sells somewhere in the world every 9 seconds, and you know, people say 100 million books or 200 million books. We've given up counting because it's a moving target. You know, by the time you count it up, you've sold some more. So all we do now is weigh the money.
That's very scar-faced.
So yeah, you know, it's been a lot. It's been a fun career, and I'm glad that I'm amazed that anybody's interested in it, but I'm glad that it's there. That if a new writer wants to see what it's like, because I honestly think you can't teach writing itself. You know, putting down a good paragraph or a good page is inexplicable. You can't explain how you're doing it, you just do it. But the rest of the business, there's a million things that you could learn that makes it a little faster and easier for you.
Yeah.
You know, I've made strategic errors here and there, and if I could say to a new writer, don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah. Could you take us back to the start and talk a little bit about how you designed Jack Reacher himself as the main character for your first novel?
Yeah, and designed is a pretty big word for how I did it, because I had been I started out. I mentioned that primary school, Cherry Orchard Primary School in Birmingham, which was very, as I said, very formal and traditional reading, writing, arithmetic, except that the headmistress, who was this fearsome old battle axe called Maisie Lister, was her name. She was a very tough disciplinarian educationalist, but she was also mental about American musical theater. And in fact, her niece was an actress called Carolyn Lister, who was in the original cast of Crossroads.
Right.
So they had this sort of show busy side to their personalities in that family. So Maisie Lister, twice a year at Christmas and in the summer, would put on a show that was basically just all her favorite songs from whatever musical she liked, stitched together with a completely meaningless plot. That probably included pirates and this and that and so on. But I just utterly fell in love with that, with what I was seeing. I first went as an audience member, and there were the bright lights and these beaming happy children on the stage and these beaming happy parents in the audience, and I could just feel that the entertainment transaction from the stage to the audience and back again in a feedback loop. It was just irresistible. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to be some kind of a performer. So immediately I tried out for her next show, and it was one of those embarrassing situations where you don't know that you can't do something. You don't know yet. So they gave me a sheet of lyrics and said, would you sing this song? And so there I am singing it, and I'm wondering, why are these people going pale? Because I have zero musical talent, just zero acting talent, zero on-stage talent, nothing at all. So I became a kind of spear carrier, third spear carrier from the left was me, but mostly a backstage person. And that was going to be my career, backstage in the theater. That's what I wanted to do. And Birmingham Rep, around the time I was 15 or so, it was brand new building. And well before the word intern or work experience was ever invented, I just walked up to it and knocked on the door, and I said, is there anything I can do? And they gave me loads of odd jobs and all of that kind of thing. And Laurence Olivier came as a guest director for a season.
No way.
So yeah, I was thrown. And then having done that, I then went the other direction down to Stratford and did the same thing at the RSC, just knocked on the door and said, is there anything I could do? And I was having a great time, but I was also serious and kind of earnest and trying to think. And I'd read this book by a very famous British theatre director called Peter Brook, who back in, I think, 1971 did Midsummer Night's Dream at Stratford that was just revolutionary and amazing. But I read his book, and the book was called The Empty Space, and he made a very cogent case that all the theatre needs is a script, some actors, and an empty space in which to perform. And I was convinced by that. And the flip side of it was, therefore, my backstage role, lighting, sound, all that kind of stuff, was fundamentally superfluous. There was no intellectual need for it. Yeah. So I thought, I'll go to television. Yeah. Because you've got to have backstage people in television. You've got to have technicians, otherwise it doesn't happen. So I got a job at Granada Television in Manchester, which turned out to be just a fabulous job. Loved it. It was a great place. It was a great job. My very first week, I started on Monday, and I was being trained by this woman who had been there for years and kind of knew everybody. And she said, on Friday, we're going for lunch with some actors. And I thought, okay, cool. So, and it was supposed to be a picnic lunch. But Granada is in Manchester, so obviously it was raining. And so the picnic was on the studio floor. And the actors were Laurence Olivier again, Alec Guinness, Ralph Richardson, and John Gielgud, which was a pretty good introduction to Granada. And it was actually, it was late in 1977. It was just after Star Wars.
Oh, no way. So he was Obi-Wan Kenobi at that point.
He was. And Guinness, and crucially, George Lucas, for the funding of that first movie, he couldn't afford to pay much up front. So Guinness had the most fantastic back-end deal, where literally he was going to make tens of millions the way it turned out. And the other three actors were pissed off. They were really jealous and trying not to show it. It was a fascinating lunch. And it just got better and better. That was a great place to work, a great job to have, until one day my boss said something to me that made it just impossible to continue there. he said, "You're fired," which was, it was part of that 1990s thing where suddenly they discovered shareholder value, and the best way to make more money was just to fire all the expensive old people and hire kids to work for a quarter of the money. And I was, by that point, an expensive old person, 39 years old I was, and I had a great salary. I was an hourly paid union worker, but it added up to a lot. And because we had sort of allowances for antisocial hours and this and that, overtime rates. I mean, there was one particular rule, Rule 10J, it was called in our union book, that if you were working overtime on a bank holiday and the overtime was spontaneously extended, you then shifted up to a multiple of 27 times your hourly pay.
Good God.
And I mean, it was rigidly, because, management is usually totally inefficient. Therefore, unless we had these safeguards, everybody would be working 24/7. So, and I remember once earning £1,000 an hour under that rule 10J.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an hour either, because another rule was if you went even 1 second into the next hour, you got paid the whole hour. And it wasn't even Granada's fault. Channel 4 had started by then, and Channel 4 overran 3 minutes. So my shift ended at 3 minutes past 1 in the morning.
Yeah.
And for that 3 minutes, I got £1,000
That's amazing.
in the middle 1980s. It was that great of a job. But it had all come to an end. It was over. And, I hadn't saved any of that money. I'd spent it having a good time. And so what was I going to do? I had 7 months. They pay you off. They give you a redundancy payment. And by the time I'd paid off a few things, I had 7 months, 7 mortgage payments in the bank. What am I going to do? And it was a problem because I'd spent almost 20 years there, and I was hyper trained and hyper skilled at the one job I'd just been kicked out of. So what next? I really didn't know. I didn't know what I was going to do. And then all of a sudden I thought, you idiot, since you were 3 years old, you've been reading 6 books a week. Why don't you try writing one? How hard can it be? That's what I thought. So that's how Reacher started. But I had learned from television in general that you cannot design a hit. You can't plan it. You can't force it. You can't make it happen. All success in entertainment is kind of accidental. Everything you do is either better or worse than you thought it was going to be. You never hit the target. And a big success is utterly random. While I was in TV, there was a show called Auf Wiedersehen, Pet. Remember that show?
Yes.
Everybody loves it, right?
Yeah.
But it was forced on us, basically. The network arrangement was that the minor companies could demand that the whole network carries the show. So whoever made Auf Wiedersehen, Pet demanded it was called a Category A program, and it had to be shown on the network. And everybody was dreading it because they thought, what? A bunch of unemployed Geordie bricklayers, who cares? That's going to be the biggest turkey of all time. But it goes on the air and becomes one of the most loved programs of all time, one of the most popular. Just shows you you can't predict it, you can't design it, you just got to hope for the best.
Yeah.
So I'd internalized that, and so I absolutely did not do a list of, okay, he's got to be this, he's got to be this, he's got to be this other thing. You can't do that. All you can do is metaphorically close your eyes and write and see what comes out. And so I did that, and Reacher came out. And initially, after the first manuscript, I finished it. I liked it. I thought it was Killing Floor. I thought, yeah, that's really good. I like that. But nobody else will.
Right.
Maybe men will, I thought. But, Reacher is a filthy, dirty barbarian. He never changes his clothes. He lies and cheats and steals. He shoots people in the back, this and that. I thought, I like him, but but maybe nobody else, and certainly women aren't going to like him, which was a disappointment to me because women are by far bigger readers of fiction than men. So if any fiction, women are going to read it more so than men, and so if you're not appealing to women, you've got no chance. So I thought, well, I was going to say a bad word there, but I'm in trouble. But that just shows you how you cannot know, and actually women are Reach's biggest fans and supporters. They really are. And so nothing is predictable, nothing can be planned or designed. You just got to hope for the best. But clearly what happened was the only real answer, where did Reacher come from? What I'd already read.
Right.
Yeah. What I'd already read filtered through my preferences. Clearly I liked I don't like underdog stories. I hate underdog stories where, they struggle and they lose and lose and lose and then eventually win in the end. That's no good to me. I want total domination from the beginning. And so I realized that what I'd done, I tapped into this long literary narrative tradition of the knight errant, the mysterious stranger that was real popular in the Middle Ages. In America, they think they invented it with the Westerns. And sure, Reacher is very like a Western character. Zane Grey, for instance, one of the great Western writers, typically there's a homestead, isolated, tiny homestead somewhere, and all the men are absent. They're on a cattle drive or something, and the women and children are huddled against this huge danger, some kind of danger or peril coming in from the outside, and it's all getting desperate. And then suddenly a silent, mysterious figure rides in off the range. And in exchange for a woman-cooked meal, he unsheathes his rifle, he takes care of the problem, and then he rides up into the sunset. And that is the paradigm, and that's been around forever. They think they invented it, they didn't at all. Go back to medieval Europe, that story is right there, where the Black Forest, for instance, was a huge, dangerous wasteland. And it wouldn't be a homestead, it would be a traveling band of pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem in dire straits about, it's all going to go wrong until suddenly a mysterious knight rides out of the trees, takes care of the problem, and rides on. So it's a permanent human narrative. It's been repeated over and over again over the centuries because we crave that. We want that. All of us. I mean, everybody in this room has got some kind of a problem. Hopefully not too serious. Could be very serious, but let's hope it's not too serious. But whatever your problem is, wouldn't it be great if one evening there's a knock on the door and it's some strong, silent type who takes care of the problem and then moves on? Because the moving on is super important. Because what do you do with them if they stick around? I mean, there's really only one of those mythic stories where they do stick around, and that's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. He solves the rat problem, and then he doesn't get paid, so he sticks around, and all kinds of mayhem ensues. But yeah, it's all about moving on, which is also a kind of the romantic appeal of that character, because there was a great book and then a movie called The Bridges of Madison County. Remember that? And that was about this isolated rural farm wife who had like a 3-day affair with a stranger passing through. And she carried that secret in her heart forever. And it meant so much to her, even though it was only 3 days. But the fact that it's only 3 days is really important, because what happens in the real world when you have an affair? It's a mess. Your wife finds out, you get divorced, you lose your house, you lose your kids. It's a mess. But it's great if the guy is fantastic for 2 or 3 days, and then you will never see him again. He will never call, he will never write, he will never show up at your door. It's the perfect secret.
You don't have to get annoyed because Jack Reacher isn't washing the dishes.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the things you talked about in this book, Reacher, which is brilliant, is you mentioned that your dad used to take you to the library and you asked him once what he was looking for. And he said, looking for the same thing but different. How do you sort of walk that line of making it the same enough but different enough, especially for such a long-running series?
Yeah, well, my dad was Irish, so the same but different was perfectly logical to him. But what he meant was, I think, obviously the same character.
Yeah.
Which is why, as a reader, I loved the series. I absolutely did. Because if you got into a series, then the next installment was pre-approved. You knew you were going to like it. You liked the guy, you liked the setup, you wanted to be back in that world. But you did need it to be sufficiently different that it didn't feel like just a rehash of what you'd already read.
Yeah.
So, and that part is, again, I'm absolutely not a planner. I never sit down with, any jotted notes or anything. A lot of writers will do big outlines, they'll pin up index cards all around their room with chapters and stuff. I'm not like that at all. I just start at the beginning. I hope I get a good first sentence. And then I think, all right, what would be a good second sentence? And then on and on and on. And there's about 11,000 sentences in the book. And so 11,000 times I'm just thinking, all right, what next? And so I don't plan it. I don't really visualize it. As long as Reach is in it, I figure he will figure it out. He'll sort it out. There'll be something that needs his attention somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's a very chaotic method. People think I'm a good plotter and that it's all expertly worked out. Absolutely not. In a little bit of a way, I do it based on, at Granada, they did a very early cooking show that was, there were 2 kitchens set up in the studio, and the researchers would put random items in the refrigerators, just anything, a piece of broccoli, a walnut, this, that, the other, just throw it in there, pork chop or whatever. And then the idea was the 2 chefs had to use everything in the refrigerators, make a nice meal. And you got points how good your meal was, but you also got bonus points if you used everything that was in the refrigerator. And that's sort of how I write. I'll just do anything in the first half of the book. Yeah, this happened, that happens. This guy, this guy's dead, that guy's dead, whatever. And then about halfway through, I think, all right, what can I do with this stuff? And then I work it out for sort of then coalesces into the second half of the book. And if I've left a walnut in the refrigerator, that's fine because it looks like a red herring.
Right. Yeah. I watched your BBC Maestro course, which was fascinating. And one of the things I loved about it was you said it's intellectually dishonest to write yourself out of a corner if you. So, for example, you've got Jack Reacher, he's surrounded, he's absolutely done in. And you could just go back and put a gun in his pocket secretly. Yeah. But you said, forget that. The writer shouldn't solve this problem. The character should solve the problem, which is a brilliant approach. Have you ever put Jack Reacher in a particular situation where you've cursed yourself for this?
Yeah, many times. It's I first really crystallized that thought. Another writer friend of mine was saying his guy was some kind of assassin who his specialty was to make it look like natural causes each time. Right. So he had this target and he was trying to get in this building. And previously, the building had been described as having this ferocious security system where you needed biometrics and everything to get in. And then much later in the book, he realized, oh shit, I got to get my guy in there. And he was having a kind of debate with himself. Should he go back and make it a simpler security system or not? And I said, no, that's not your problem. That's your character's problem.
Yeah.
And so, Reacher deals with whatever comes along. And I've had to, and it sounds mental to say it's not me working out, it's him working it out. Because, who's doing the typing here? It's obviously me. But I do feel that it is him in a way. So, I'll just let him do whatever needs doing.
Have you ever tried plotting out all in advance before you write, or was it never a consideration?
Well, no, because with the first one, it was a panic. You know, I had to get it done quick. I didn't have time for all that research and planning. And then I developed the feeling that for me, it's the story. I just want to know the story. I want to know what happens. And if I had plotted that out beforehand, mapped it out so I did know what happened, and then sat down to type the book, I would be bored with it. By that point, I want the next story. So I need to not know. I need to work it out as I go along. And sometimes, yeah, it can, but there was one I remember where I think it's Gone Tomorrow, where I had this stunningly beautiful young Russian girl going around with her mother. And for the longest time, I assumed, oh, that Russian girl is going to be the love interest here. But no, she turned into the bad guy. She was actually the most sinister murderer.
When you started working with your brother Andrew on Reacher, he was obviously already a very successful author. Was he already working in a similar style to yourself, or did you have to sort of find some strategic middle ground?
No, it worked. I mean, he'd done 9 thrillers of his own, and he's a good writer, you know, I had no doubts about that.
Yeah.
But the irony for him was that he's so much younger than me that by the time he started doing it, I was already well established. And at that point, he didn't want to feel like he was piggybacking on my success. He didn't want to feel like he was, anything to do with me.
Yeah.
So for his first 9 books, he had to try as hard as possible to not sound like me.
Oh, right.
Which then when he started doing them, obviously he could relax and sound like me, because we're very similar people, so we're going to sound the same. But yeah, that whole thing of handing it over to Andrew was, again, based on what I had felt as a reader, especially as a kid and as a younger adult. You would get into an author or a series and you would be eating it up, 4, 5, 6 books, great. And then the 7th book or the 8th, you suddenly understood the author has gotten bored with this. Yeah. The author's got lazy, he's running out of gas, he's got no energy left. And practically every series that happened to, I felt. Alistair MacLean, for instance, who I mentioned before, I think possibly the first 8 Alistair MacLeans are just fabulous thrillers, just absolutely iconic. And then he got lazy and drunk and he went to Switzerland to be a tax exile and bored, and then it just totally fell off a cliff. There was, again, an American author called Robert B. Parker who wrote Spencer. That's a great series. And he was the same, actually quicker, I thought. The first 4 or 5 were good, and then he went into this long, long dip.
Yeah.
And the last few were better. It was like a U-shaped thing. But I found that happened so often, and I felt as a reader, as a younger person, sort of eager and naive and wanting the next book, I felt utterly betrayed when an author did that, when they didn't care anymore. So when I started writing, I made an absolute solid promise to myself that if I had the faintest feeling that I was running out of gas and starting to go downhill, I would terminate it at that point. I did not want to be in a position of phoning it in and giving people a substandard product. So I was always aware, waiting for that point. When do I run out of gas? And I think, Blue Moon was the last book I did completely solo. That was the 24th Reacher novel. Yeah. So I did 24 solo. And Blue Moon, I don't think anybody could necessarily know by reading it, but there were 2 days when I just thought, I don't want to do this today. And I took that as a bad sign. And so then it was how to get out of it, what to do next. And my original plan had been to recognize the point and then write the last book in the series.
Right.
And I even had a title for it. It was going to be called Die Lonely. And it would have ended up somehow, it would have ended up with Reacher maybe sacrificing himself for the person he was looking after. And this final scene, Reacher on a filthy motel bathroom floor bleeding to death.
Oh God.
That was going to be Die Lonely. Because I thought a noble old warhorse like that needed a definitive end.
Yeah.
But then I thought, no, people really like Reacher, and that is too gratuitously cruel to the reader. So then plan B was I was going to have a sort of metaphoric version of that. You know, whatever the story is, it's all wrapped up, and we have the traditional end scene where Reacher sheds all the extraneous possessions he's picked up, and he walks to the bus depot to head out of town. I thought we could have a metaphoric version where he gets halfway to the bus depot and he thinks, actually, this is a pretty nice place. I think I'll adopt a dog and rent an apartment. And that would be like the metaphorical explanation. But I wasn't too happy with that. I was just miserable about the whole thing. I thought, I will not carry on if I'm running out of energy, but I was very, very upset about finishing it. And I was developing all these kind of fantasies. I would go down to the crossroads at midnight and sell my soul in exchange for a magic potion that would make me 15 years younger again, full of the old energy and ideas and stamina. But of course, there are no magic potions. But then I thought, wait a minute, you idiot. You know somebody who is you 15 years ago, and that's my brother, who we're very similar in terms of how we react to things, and he is that much younger, and yeah, probably not as good of a writer, but, you know, good enough. And he's been involved with Reacher since day zero, really, because I wrote that first manuscript, as you said, in pencil, and I needed feedback on it, and Andrew was the only person I knew who was really that deep into thrillers in the same way that I was. I mean, Andrew is slightly more espionage-y than I am, but there's an awful lot of books that we share, having read and loved. So I sent the paper manuscript, the pencil manuscript, to Andrew to just tell me, is it any good or not? And so he saw it at that point. So he's been involved with Reacher all along. I mean, it was a fairly easy transition for him.
Oh, brilliant. I would love to ask you about the TV show, which recently won the Golden Tomato. These things are, you know, they're important from Rotten Tomatoes being the best reviewed action series on TV. Given your experience at Granada, was it fun for you to see the TV show take shape and be such a massive success?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it was crucially different though, because by the time it rolled around, I'd been out of television for literally 25 years.
Yeah.
Which is about 100 generations in terms of how TV developed. So I was completely a dinosaur. And in particular, the streaming television thing had been invented, which is a whole different art form in a way that, because the binging aspect has to be so powerful. And it's a technique all of its own. It's about sort of pacing and intensity where each episode starts very strong and then maybe it just mellows and eases a little bit and then finishes with a new pulse of energy so that you're pushed into watching the next episode.
Right, yeah.
It's a skill all its own. So I did not feel really qualified to analyze what they were doing because it was really streaming and binging is a whole new art form compared to what we used to call appointment television. So, but yeah, it was great to be involved, crucially because streaming television has two advantages over feature films. Number one is the running time. You can have 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours to tell the story instead of 90 minutes like you do in a feature film. And that gives you the chance to put it all in, you know, the quiet bits, the funny bits, the slightly off the wall bits, you can keep them all in. So that's number one advantage. And the number two advantage is that whereas in a feature film, it's the actor that attracts the investment. The actor has to literally make people feel reassured that they can put millions of dollars into this and they'll get something out of it. So the stature of the actor, his track record, it is very important. Whereas for streaming television, the platform pays for it. Right. Amazon just gives you the money and says, do what you want. And so the actor doesn't matter. Right. Which meant we had a huge liberty. We could just choose whoever we wanted, which was a huge relief after the previous debacle with the previous actor.
In terms of stature.
Which was, yeah, I mean, the feature films was with Tom Cruise was a weird thing. Because in 2005, that deal was done.
Yeah.
And nothing happened for 6 years until 2011. But yeah, in 2005, Paramount had bought the property. But as you know, when you see a movie, there's always half a dozen different production companies at the beginning with their logos, because you need more than one investor. So Paramount was the lead investor, but then a load of other people chipped in as well, including Cruise Wagner, which was a production company run by Tom Cruise. And he invested simply as an investor. He was going to get a share of the profits should there be any. And so then nothing happened for 6 years until a guy called Christopher McQuarrie wrote the screenplay for the first one. And it was an excellent screenplay, just fabulous, great content, really well done. And then that gets circulated to all the interested parties. I got a copy, all the various producers got copies, obviously including Tom Cruise. And because it was such a great screenplay, he read it and he thought, wow, I want to play this guy. And generally speaking, if a star of that magnitude says, I want to do this, it happens. Yeah. And so McQuarrie and the main producer from Paramount called me and said, they're coming to New York. They want to take me to dinner to discuss something. And I knew by the restaurant that they'd nominated, it was the most expensive and the most hard to get into restaurant in New York. So I thought, if we're going there, it's because Tom Cruise is going to play Reacher. So I show up and sure enough, a little bit of small talk, and I say, come on guys, it's Cruise, isn't it? Just tell me. And they said, yeah, he wants to do it. And I had a second, probably. If I'd thrown myself on the floor screaming, they would have canceled it. Yeah. But shamefully, I spent that second thinking, well, here's the world's last remaining global movie star.
Absolutely, yeah.
Offering to spend $150 million promoting my brand around the world. How do I feel about that? And I thought, pretty good, actually. Well, I knew that it would be a catastrophe from the point of view of the reader, who had, we were, by this point, how many? Like 14, 15 books in. Yeah. And so the readers had their absolute version of Reacher in their head, and Tom Cruise was not going to match that. Yeah. But I put a clause in the thing saying after 2 movies I had a veto whether there would be any more. Yeah. Because I thought, I'll put up with this for 2 movies and reap the benefit. And the benefit was fantastic. It really was. That first movie came out December 2012. A few weeks later, in January 2013, I had 8 old paperbacks in the top 10 on the New York Times. Yeah. It really worked. Yeah. And then, the second movie I thought was poor compared to the first. Yeah. But that was the commitment. And at that time, by that time, streaming television had been invented. Because back in 2005, it was unknown. Not enough people had broadband, and it just wasn't a thing. And then it was. by 2017, I suppose,
Yeah.
everybody was doing that, and Netflix really wanted Reacher, and I assumed that we would sell it to Netflix, but then Amazon came in later with more enthusiasm, not necessarily more money, but although it was more money, but I never judge it on for a thing like that. My rule is you go where the love is,
Right.
not where the money is.
Yeah.
Because money is a one-time thing, and if it's done by people who really want to do it and love it, then it'll carry on and on and on.
Yeah.
And so it's better done that way. And yeah, it's been great. Alan Richardson. I mean, we thought after the Tom Cruise thing, everybody was so aware of that. We were casting Reacher, and we sort of agreed we're going to find the biggest ever seen. It's a strange thing. There aren't very many big actors.
Yeah.
I've worked with actors literally all my life, and all actors are small. They really are. And television actors in particular are small with very large heads. I would really love to understand why. It's some sort of optical relationship, the face and the lens. Because cinema is well over 100 years old now, and we've evolved to this position where actors are tiny. Even the actors you think are big are not big.
Yeah, isn't Sylvester Stallone like 5'8"?
Yeah. I mean, Sylvester Stallone is no taller than Tom Cruise.
Oh, right.
People were saying to me, Daniel Craig should play Reacher. I mean, Daniel Craig is 5'6".
Right.
And I was on a plane with him once. I got up to go to the bathroom and tripped over him. It is very, very rare. Clint Eastwood, who everybody thinks is a big man, he's absolutely not.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's that. If I stood next to him, he's much shorter than I am. And I was once talking to a wardrobe mistress at Warner Brothers, and she took me into this refrigerated store where they keep all the old costumes. And the tweed jacket that he wore in Dirty Harry, she got it out of its bag and gave it to me to try on. And it was like, nobody's big. So we had about 6 or 7 actors of the right size to choose from. That was all. And Alan really fit the bill. He commanded the screen. He had that sort of implacable presence that Reacher has. So I thought, yeah, this guy will do. And he turned out to be a very fun guy as well. The very first time we met, Amazon had arranged a kind of promotional thing where we would interview each other.
Oh, right.
And so, literally, it was in Canada. Everything is shot in Toronto now. So I go up to Toronto and literally we sit down exactly like this, the first minute we met. And I could tell he had a bit of a sense of humor because his first question was, "So, Lee, how delighted were you when you found out I was going to play?" But I was kind of ready for that. And that's my sort of sense of humor too. So I said, "Alan, I was thrilled, especially after our first choice said no. And our second choice. And our third choice." So it carried on like that. He's a nice guy, yeah, terrific. Works hard. I mean, actors work very hard. Cruise works unbelievably hard. If people think Hollywood's all glamour and relaxing by the pool and all of that, absolutely not. I mean, you can imagine watching the seasons on Amazon with Alan Richardson, the fighting and all of that. They do that all day long, multiple takes and so on, bruised and battered and injured a lot of the time, broken bones even sometimes. They work incredibly hard.
I just wanted to ask you one more thing, and then we'll open up to a Q&A from any of you guys, if you guys have got any questions. I recently read about your work, and you've been named as the National Reading Laureate for your work on literacy and prisoners. I wonder if you could talk, please, about how that came about and what the goal was for that.
Yeah, I was talking to an MP from Yorkshire who seemed to be a really smart guy. And really, when you, his attitude was, he'd been a local councillor and all of this, and so he was very much tuned into what a local constituency needs and feels. And his belief that is matched by mine. I mean, I've been all over the world. I've lived in different countries. I've listened to thousands of people talking about their lives. And at the end of the day, what people want is to live in a safe and pleasant street, in a safe and pleasant community. If they have that, that's 80% of all they'll ever want from politics.
Yeah.
So how do you make that happen? How do you make sure a community is safe and pleasant? Well, there's presumably millions of ways of doing it, but they presumably all cost a lot of money, or at least some extra money, and there is no extra money. So how do you do it with no extra money? And our idea was that every week, hundreds of people get out of prison having completed their sentence. And too many of them come back to prison because they're not making it on the outside. And so we figured if we could stop even 1 in 10 people from reoffending and going back, then that immediately frees up a lot of police time and money, court time and money, and above all else, prison time and money. It costs £55,000 a year to keep a person in prison. So if you could keep 1 in 10 from reoffending, then you don't increase the budget at all. You know, there's no more budget. There's nothing coming out of taxes. It's the same amount of money, but the density of that money is increased. It means you can spend that money on the people that really need the money spent on them. You know, because a lot of people in prison are total scumbags who deserve to be there forever. You know, there's no doubt about that. So you can spend the money on them. And the people that shouldn't be there, you can try and help. And there are people there who are, you know, this basically, women's prisons are terrible for this. There are women in prison because they did not pay their TV license. You know, the thing comes in the mail that they can't read, they don't know what it is, then a warning comes and another warning and then a fine, and they don't know what it is, they don't pay the fine, and they end up in prison, which is the stupidest thing. If they could have read that first notice, they would have probably taken care of it. And there are people that have been bad people that are now pretty much reformed, and they want to go out and be useful, they want a job, they want to live somewhere. They can't get a job because they're hopeless at reading, they can't even read a lease, so they can't rent a flat. It's a disability in people's lives. And so we thought, if we taught people to read, then maybe we could get that 1 in 10 that won't go back. 2 out of 10 would be success beyond our wildest dreams. But yeah, so it was about enthusing them about books, teaching them how to read, and also what we learned as we went along is writing is incredibly important to them. That they need, if they can externalize their trauma or whatever, then they're better off. If they can feel heard, they're better off. But, you know, people say, am I soft on crime? And I say, have you ever read a Jack Reacher book? Am I a soft person? No, but I'm a practical person. And here's a way of helping communities by, without extra expenditure, just keep the money that we're already spending, but remove certain people from the system so that we have more per capita for actual crimes.
That's fantastic. Does anybody else have any questions for Mr. Child as well? Yes.
At what time in your life did you realise that Aston Villa were the only football team that really mattered? Because I still think there's a lot of people that don't realise there's at least one character in every Jack Reacher book named after Villa.
Yeah, well, that was that. Actually, it was just that point in my life was just a tiny bit more than 64 years ago. Easter Saturday of 1962. There was a kid up the road where I lived who, his dad was a West Bromwich fan, and he had a season ticket and one for the kid. And so for a period of a couple of months, this kid and I, we would go up to his workshop. He worked in a little metalworking workshop in West Bromwich. And we would go on about 12 o'clock on a Saturday. And if it was a reserve game, I would get his season ticket because he didn't want to go to a reserve game, and me and my friend would go. If he had to work overtime that afternoon, I would get the first team as well. So the first 3 or 4 times I went to football was at the Hawthorns. And then one time, about a week before Easter in 1962, we go to a reserve game at the Hawthorns, and it was Villa reserves against West Bromwich reserves in the old Central League. And Derek Dugan was playing for Villa reserves. And much later on, I found out he'd been in a terrible car crash not long before. So this was a kind of run out in order for fitness, basically. But the Villa reserves with Dugan in it they were like a bunch of swaggering pirates. I just absolutely loved them. They just knocked me out. I was 7 years old, and I thought, this is my team. And so I didn't go with my friend anymore. I betrayed him completely. And the next Saturday was Easter Saturday, 1962. And I went to Villa Park on my own. I was 7. I walked to Villa Park. My house was equidistant exactly between the Hawthorns and Villa Park. So I just walked the other way, went to Villa Park. And, my parents were super responsible, super normal, conventional parents, but that's how it was for kids in the old days. On a Saturday, you had breakfast and they never saw you again until it got dark. And so I walked to Villa Park, I had sixpence with me. And I thought, I had no idea how much it would cost to get in. But of course, it costs nothing to get in. When you're a 7-year-old on your own, there's always a bunch of geezers who will smuggle you in on the and they'll make sure you're okay at the front of the hold. And so I go there, April 1962, and the Villa playing Leicester in the first division. Villa won 8-3. So I thought, damn, this is football. This is great. So 2 days later, I did the same thing, Easter Monday. Villa at home against Nottingham Forest, won that 5-1. So I thought in 48 hours, I've seen 13 goals. This is totally my team. And I was committed forever, which of course was a poison chalice for the next decade. But yeah, what can you do? This is how football gets you. You can't do anything about it.
How did you enjoy your time on Desert Island Discs? I certainly enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thanks. Yeah, I thought, like Martin said, I got a CBE. But actually being on Desert Island Discs, I think, is even better than that. Then you really know you've made it. And I thought it's a difficult format. You've got to choose 8 tracks of music. And, you could choose 800 and not be halfway there. So it's a bit arbitrary picking out the 8. But yeah, I enjoyed it, I like doing those radio things because you're sitting at a mic like this and you have headphones on and you can hear yourself and you can put on a really good radio voice.
Yes.
Lee, I was wondering if you maybe have an ulterior motive for coming here today, because many decades ago, another very famous author came here with initial CD. I know you like a quiz.
An initial CD, Charles Dickens. Yeah.
But he came to Redditch twice. The first time he enjoyed it so much, he came back again in 1853. And he documented the needle industry, because we're very famous here for making very sharp implements. And thinking of Jack Reacher, we also made the Royal Enfield motorcycle, whose trademark was
made by like a gun.
built like a gun.
Built like a gun.
Okay.
So
The question really is, are you here looking for a story?
Well, I'm actually not. Although, yeah, I know all those old stories and love them all. And by a coincidence, a week from next Thursday, I'm doing a thing with the BBC. They're doing a sort of drama documentary about Dickens's life. And they want me to comment on how sort of modern he was in the sense of Pickwick Papers was his first novel, and that had merchandising alongside it. He was there were a lot of pre-echoes of modern publishing in Dickens. But anyway, that's by the by. I'm doing it because I'm a big supporter of libraries. And, you know, I lived in America for nearly 30 years until a year ago, January. I left America 2 days before the inauguration.
Is that why you left?
That is why I left, yeah. You know, all government ultimately depends on the consent of the governed, and I refuse to be governed by that squalid crew. So I left and I worked, yeah. As a person my age, you know, I fell in love with the sort of mythical, legendary post-war America. You know, the 50s, the 60s, where it was a big, optimistic, energetic country, full of goodwill, really, full of excitement. And there was a line I heard much later that I wish I had invented, which was, for a person my age, they said, they have Cadillacs and Coca-Cola. We have Lucasade and Morris Minors. And that's sort of how I felt. You know, I wanted that America. And the first time I ever visited America was 52 years ago in 1974. And absolutely you could feel that still there. And then emigrated in 1998. And again, absolutely, you could just, the old America was still there. 74 was a revelation in a way. In the 1970s, in America, income equality was better than it is in Norway today. And in those 3 post-war decades, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, income equality in America was better than anywhere in Scandinavia today. It was a different country. And it's been changing in the same way that Britain did. You know, the end of the post-war consensus, 1979, 1980, Britain changed, America changed. But now it is just toxic, unpleasant, divided, spiteful. And for me, you know, I was an immigrant, obviously. And the rhetoric that was coming out of the Republicans, you know, apparently I was garbage, I was vermin, I was poisoning the blood of the country, which was news to me. You know, I felt that, or I'd never taken a cent from America. All I'd done was entertain the native population and paid tens and tens of millions of dollars in income tax. That's, I thought, what I was doing, but apparently not. Whereas there is a person in America whose mother was an immigrant, and maybe she poisoned the blood of the country. You know, that's something that you should think about.
Yes.
Was there anything in particular that inspired the name for Reacher?
Well, yeah. It was, you know, another gentleman mentioned that I put a lot of villa names in there, and that's partly out of a sort of in-joke thing for myself and for clued-in readers, but it's also partly because, weirdly, the hardest thing for me is making up names. To make up a character name that sounds real or plausible, I find really hard. So when I started out writing the first book, it's written in the first person. I did this, I did that, and therefore I didn't need to know his name until somebody asks him his name. And sure enough, somewhere in chapter 2, the cop or the detective says, "What's your name?" And I had not decided. I just couldn't come up with anything. But as I said, I was out of work. And the huge problem with being out of work is that you're at home all the time. And the huge problem with that is your wife assumes you're available to do stuff. And so I was, it was like a Friday night or something, and I was really looking forward to getting on with the book the next morning. But my wife said, "Oh, no, you got to come to the supermarket with me," because she's tiny and she can't carry anything, and so I had to go and do all of that. So that taught me two things. First of all, I was really upset that I wasn't going to be able to write the book. You know that feeling you have when you're reading a great book and you've got to stop for some reason? You get that sort of annoyed feeling. You can't really explain it. It's just, I want to keep on doing this. So I felt that about not being able to write, and I took that as a really good sign. I thought, yeah, this could really work if I feel like this. But of course, the second thing was actually in the supermarket, where every single time I go into a supermarket, which by now must number well into double figures, I go in and there is always a little old lady who says, "Oh, you're a nice tall gentleman. Will you reach me that cat?" So my wife, who was putting on a really brave face, I mean, we were staring catastrophe in the face. You know, I was out of work, we had no money, but she was biting her lip and being very brave about it. And so this, sure enough, a little old lady said, "Would you reach me that box or whatever?" And my wife said to me, "You know what, if this writing gig doesn't work out, you could be a reacher in a supermarket." And I thought, damn, that's a good name.
When you had sort of feeling that you were coming to the end of your relationship with Reacher, did you ever think of making another relationship, and perhaps with a woman?
Well, yeah. Well, I've got absolutely no objection to it in real life. I mean, I think, yeah, the only negative for me for that is I'm incredibly lazy. And having gotten that far with Reacher, and I was at that point, 60 odd or something like that, I thought I was too lazy to start anything new. But theoretically, yeah, I would, and I sort of have, I think, in a lot of the previous books, the woman is just as important as Reacher. And I think that people misinterpret it a little bit, that people call Reacher lover and leaver type of a guy, but that's not true. Reacher would love to stick with these women, except they can't bear him because his lifestyle is too weird. It is the woman who leaves Reacher, not Reacher leaves the woman. So I try and make the women characters as strong and as authentic as I can. But should I start a new series with a woman solely? If I was starting over again, I might do that, yeah. But like I say, I'm old, I'm lazy, and I want to be retired. It's been a lifelong ambition of mine, actually, to be retired. Because when I was starting primary school at Cherry Orchard, my grandfather was retiring at that exact same time. And I did not know what the concept meant. And I remember asking my dad, what does that mean, retiring? And he said, well, now he's just going to sit at home and do nothing, do whatever he wants. And there was me starting up with all this reading, writing, arithmetic and stuff. And I thought, damn, that sounds pretty good. So it's been fixed in my head ever since I was 4 that retirement is a goal. And I'm determined to get there one day.
Yes.
Bobby, when you're writing like fight scenes and stuff, how do you do research to make them believable?
The question was, how do I do the research for the fight scenes to make them believable? And I don't do any research. That's all memory. Because I mean, there are people my age here, and think back. The Birmingham as a whole was, generally speaking, a very emotionally inarticulate place. Plus, those times were very traditional and macho. Everything was a fight. Especially back then when, like I had said, my parents were ambitious for us in terms of education. So in the primary school, which was just a regular city primary school, we were doing well. And if you're doing well at school, that puts a target on your back. You are above yourself. You are a class traitor, all of that stuff. We were, targeted because we were doing well in school. And my elder brother was a weedy little guy. And I remember when I started primary school, we'd already moved to Birmingham, so he was starting the same time I was. So I was starting in the reception class, and he was joining like class 2 or 3 or something. And as much as it pained them, it must have pained them terribly, my respectable parents. They said, my first job was at break time, at playtime, or at lunchtime. My first job was to go and make sure Richard was all right. And so from the age of 4 3/4, I would run out and find out whoever was pulling his ears or bullying him or whatever, haul them off, smack them around a bit, and then go and play with my friends. Because I was a giant kid. He had been, he was small anyway, but he had the terrible problem with eating. He hated to eat. And he still does. He hates eating, which is the weirdest thing. You know, if I said to you, let's go to dinner, you know, that sounds like a pleasant activity, right? If I said that to my brother, my older brother, let's go to dinner, it's like saying, let's stick needles in our eyes. He just hates it. So he was scrawny and tiny, and by contrast, I was born huge. I was already big. He was probably 7 by the time I was starting school, and I was bigger than him already. I was an excellent fighter. I loved it. It was, and then especially when I went to the fancy high school, I would have literally 2 fights a day, getting out of the neighborhood and getting back into the neighborhood. And, but I was really good at it, and I loved it. And at primary school, I ran a kind of, wasn't really a protection racket, it was like a mutual aid. It was not at all protection. It was a mutual aid society. So if anybody could give me their biscuits that their mother sent, then they were on the list, and I would look after them if they had a problem. And there was, numerous people. I remember one little girl called Jill, and this is a serious sort of issue that this other kid was interfering with her around the back of the toilets. And she told me this, and so on a bound, because she'd subscribed her biscuits, I had to sort this kid out. And I remember it very well. I followed him home, which was not in my direction, down a different street. I followed him home, and I knew that there was this undeveloped lot where a steep bank with a lot of nettles. So I caught up with him and rolled him down this nettle patch. And then I went home, and sure enough, his mother called my mother. And she said, did you roll whatever his name was down the nettle bank? And I said, no, never heard of it. What nettle bank? So yeah, the fighting is all memories from when I was 9, basically. Although the last fight I ever had, the last serious physical fight I ever had was now about 12 years ago. I was 59, and I lost a step, clearly, but because I won. I was coming home from a very late night thing. I had been to a party, and I was walking up Lower Broadway at about 4:30 in the morning, going home, and this taxi cab suddenly stopped right across the street from me. And the problem was that the passenger in the back was this drunken frat boy, lout, and the driver was afraid he was going to throw up because he didn't look good. And if you throw up in the cab, then that's a biohazard, and the cab is off the road for the rest of the day. And here's this tiny little Sikh guy who rented that cab for $250 for the shift probably, and he was going to lose it all if he couldn't get this boy out of the back of the cab. So I crossed the street and hauled this big fat frat boy out on behalf of the taxi driver, and this guy hit me. It shows that I'm losing a step. I let him hit me, and he actually cut my eyebrow terribly. And so obviously I gave him a battering because, do not, don't try it on with me.
So the Birmingham in you.
Yeah, exactly. You can say the boy out of Birmingham. But,
You are Jack Reed.
so I gave him a good, I left him thrown on the sidewalk, definitely he will have had to go to hospital. And I went home, but I was all bleeding, and in fact, I still got the pillowcase that is got blood marks on it. And I saw my daughter by chance the next day, and she said, "Dad, you got to go to get stitches." And again, in the traditional Birmingham way, I said, "Oh, it'll be fine." And she said, "No, go and get stitched." So I went and had 8 stitches for $1,000 at the urgent care clinic.
Anybody else? Yes.
You say that you write in the moment, it's not sort of free time. Do you have like a set location, or do you like to change your setting to, refresh
You mean where I write?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I always used to, I always had an office, so-called. In some of the houses we've had, it would just be like a spare bedroom. A couple of times I've had separate offices where, you have to go out of your house to get to. Even, I lived in an apartment once, and my actual apartment where I lived was on the 25th floor, and my office was an identical apartment on the 7th floor. So, and it gave me the sense of going to work in a way. And more valuably, I think, not bringing work home. Because the problem with doing it when you're working at home is that, at midnight you'll suddenly think, shit, that was a bad word, I should use this other word. And you're tempted to go back and start up again. But yeah, I need a space of my own, not because of any practical use, because it's just you and a keyboard, but I need a space of my own just to emphasize that this is a job. Now I'm at work. It's not that I'm sitting in the corner of the living room with a laptop. I have to feel that it's real and it's a thing,
As a bit of a follow-on from the lady here, you go into quite a lot of detail with the army. Obviously, Reacher was in the army. Well, he was an MP in the army. So some of it is really detailed. So you must have researched some, unless you were in the army yourself.
Yeah, the question is about the military research for Reacher having been in the army. And yeah, I'm very dubious about research, really. And I'm not saying that to be flippant. The flippant answer is I don't do any research, not for that particular book, because we're locked into a book a year schedule, which I think it works really well for readers and publishers. From the reader's point of view, a book a year, you're waiting for it, you're ready for it, you're anticipating it, it's something you're looking forward to. But a year is not long enough that they've forgotten about you yet. So it's a really great rhythm. But if you're doing a book a year, that's quite hard work. It's quite a lot of months writing the book. And so if you were to do specific research for that book that you're writing now, by definition, that research would be very fresh. It would be brand new in your head. And it would not yet have settled and percolated, because research is exactly like an iceberg. 10% of it is important. The other 90% doesn't really matter. And it takes you a little while to filter that through and understand which is the important part. So the flippant answer is I don't do any research. The pretentious answer is for a writer, everything in their life is research. Literally everything. Everything you see, every book you read, every movie you watch, every person you talk to, everything is sooner or later going to come back and be helpful. And so the thing about the US Army is that it doesn't take great pains to keep itself secret. It's a very well-known organization. It's a huge thing. There are thousands of books about it. We've all read hundreds of books about, war stories, this and that. And so I felt for the military stuff, how different is any soldier's experience, really? Probably going all the way back to the Romans. All soldiers probably felt the same way about most things. And my dad was in the army during World War II, like everybody's dad. And his main message afterward was, the thing that really stuck with him, apart from the, the combat and the horrific things as a 20-year-old that you should really not be exposed to. Apart from that stuff, the thing that stuck with him most was how different the military universe is to the civilian universe. Different in standards, different in imperatives, different in every way. I mean, my dad was a super law-abiding guy. It would have pained him terribly to break a law. But in the army, he told me this story of the Normandy beaches. He was responsible for, he was basically an engineer that fixed tanks. So he had to have his people, his company, and he had to have his spare parts. And the spare parts didn't make it, didn't come up the beach, they'd sunk. So he stole them from a Canadian company on the next beach. And that, would have, in civilian life, he wouldn't have dreamed of that, but it had to be done for the military. And so I would listen to those stories and piece it together. And so I write Reach's military experience as an amalgam of everything I've read from history and snippets of conversations that I've had from people. And, it comes across. The other thing about writing a book is if you put something down in black and white with confidence, people assume it's true. And it isn't really, it's totally made up. And many times in America, when I would do a book publicity tour, we would try to go to military bases where, they could buy the books or their parents could buy them and ship them over to wherever they were deployed. So we would go to these bases and I would meet real soldiers. And I was very nervous at first. Because I said to one of them once, am I getting this even a little bit right? And the guy said, well, it's not like that in my unit, but I'm sure it is in other units. If you state it with confidence, they believe it.
Would you put Reacher back in the army for a special operation? And I liked it when he was in the army.
Yeah,
I don't like him sitting in cafes drinking fools.
Well, we've got a discussion going here. The question was about the prequels where Reacher is in the army. And this lady prefers those to where he's sitting around in diners drinking cups of coffee. And it's, I like the prequels as well, because, it changes it up from my point of view. And it also removes the biggest stumbling block with any Reacher book is that Reacher is an individual on his own. He has no job, he has no responsibility, he's not a private detective, he's not a policeman. He has no reason whatsoever to ever get involved with anything. So every book essentially has to start with a coincidence that he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the story starts out from there, which is okay because readers have a kind of subconscious bargain with a writer. The reader says, I'll give you one ridiculous thing, but then the rest of it better make sense. And the one ridiculous thing is how unbelievably once a year, something happening I've got to deal with. The other 364 days, it doesn't happen. But getting him in as a solo person, getting him into a story is always slightly tricky. Whereas if it's a prequel where he's in the army and it's his actual job to go and do something, that's a lot easier.
They could ask him to rejoin for this special mission.
They could ask him to rejoin for a special mission, yeah, but then who are they going to? There's a line in this autumn's book coming out that Reacher is he's rubbing up against people that are still in the army, and there's this colonel who is a bit sniffy about him, and Reacher says, "Oh, you're one of those colonels that would have disapproved of me as a subordinate." And the colonel says, is there any other kind of colonel? So I'm not sure anybody would ask Reacher to rejoin, to be honest, because he's a nightmare.
I think we've got time for one more question. Yep.
Any possibilities of having Jack Reacher meeting up with Gabriel Allon?
Well, you know, there's a lot of those kind of putting two characters together that get suggested. But first of all, I'd have to work with another author.
Daniel Silver.
Silver, yeah. And the other thing is, technically, legally, the copyrights and the licenses and all of that would be, because we're almost certainly with different publishers, and therefore it would be very, very difficult to do institutionally. But I like Daniel Silver. But he is kind of the flip side of me in a way, in terms of where he writes about. And he illustrates a danger for me that you can just go wrong without realizing it. And so I'm always hyper vigilant about what I do about America. Whereas I think it was called The Unlikely Spy.
Yeah.
Is that one of its titles? And that book is it's just prior to D-Day. A matter of a week or so before D-Day in 1944. And there's the unlikely spy of the title is a Cambridge Don who is suddenly recruited to sort out a certain problem that has to be solved within 6 days. And the opening scene is this guy, he's given an office somewhere in Whitehall, and he's had a long day. He finishes at 7 o'clock in the evening. And he steps out into the gathering dusk of London. Whereas immediately you think, wait a minute, we're 1 week away from June 6th. So that is, say, June 1st. It's not dark at 7 o'clock in the evening. And that's something that a foreigner gets wrong about Britain, that presumably I get wrong about America. But the slightest thing can burst the bubble. Because after reading that, I thought this guy's head is not in the game.
Well, thank you so much for coming to visit us today. I really appreciate it.